Okay, welcome to part 1 of this tutorial series type thing. So in this video, as usual again, I'm going to be explaining the database structure and the folder structure. So in the previous video you saw these 3 pages. I've removed the PHP code from them. I've left all the HTML just because keep it short, keep it simple. So if I just open the profile page, you can see this is like the sort of core template of a user's profile that we had before. And then if I just go to user list, blank page, and edit profile, it's basically a form that does nothing and has no information in it. So it just basically reloads the page, this button. So yeah, pretty much nothing there. Come on, go back, there we go. So folder structure is basically the same one we always use. In the root we have these 3 files, which are the pages, and then we have this core folder, and each of these pages will include this init file from the core folder. And this file will like set up the system and include any backend files that we need. And these backend files are in this inc folder, and the only one we have is this user.inc.php, and that's going to provide 3 functions for the users, and we'll get to those when we need to. So that's pretty much it in terms of sort of folder structure really. So onto the database. If I just go to phpMyAdmin here, I've deleted the table I used to demonstrate it. Demonstrate the system, that is, and I've left the database because you should know how to create a database. It's pretty simple. On the home page you just have to click you have to type in a database name and click create. So I haven't deleted the whole database just because there's no real need to, but I am going to be creating a new table because that's the complicated part. So what we're going to be doing is create a new table on database user profile. That's the database name. So the database is going to, the table is going to be called users, and it's going to have 8 fields. So we're going to hit go, and you see we get this monstrous table, and in this table we are going to enter the database folder table. That's it, table information. So the first field is going to be the user's ID, sort of a unique number which links to their user account. The second one is their username, username spelled wrong. Then we're going to have their first and last name, so user first name and user last name. And then we're going to have their email address, their sort of about me type information. And that was what showed up sort of at the very bottom of the profile from part 0. So that's like, it can be anything, people write all kinds of nonsense in there. Like, my name is this, I live in somewhere, I like cats, don't like dogs. It's not really me. Yeah, I tend to use them blank. So user location is the next one. So that's come up, that's good. Ooh, down. And then finally we're going to have their gender. So if this was like a real table, you'd probably have their password and maybe the date they registered, but just for this I'm leaving that out because we're not creating a login system, we are creating a profile system. So all we're doing here is like, this is all information, it's not like system useful stuff. It's like just for the profile basically, there's no other reason for any of this, except their email maybe. No, obviously the username would be used for login. Right, okay, so data types. The user ID is going to have a type integer, which means number, not decimal number, and it's going to have a length of 8. So I'm just going to set that like that. And the username is going to be a varchar, and that's going to be a length of 24. The same is going to be used for the first name and the last name, like so. And the email address, I've said this before, they can potentially be like 320 characters, I think it might be that, or 255 lots basically, but we're going to set 128 because that's quite long, and if anyone has an email address that long then they're ridiculous and they shouldn't be allowed an email address. I don't know. Yeah, so we're going to set that quite large just to accommodate for people that have ridiculous email addresses. User about is going to be a text, which is just a very large, it's you can think of it as a very large varchar field. It's like very large, not just like 1,000, like millions. I can't actually remember the limit, but it's a lot. So they'll be able to type sort of within reason, they'll be able to type unlimited data in there and it'll display on their profile. So if someone wants to write like a huge chunk of text about themselves, then they can do. So user location, we're going to set to a varchar, and the length is going to be 12. So this will allow for like UK, like I showed in the demo, or like a town, the name of a town or something. So yeah. And user gender is going to be a bool, and that doesn't need a length. This is just sort of an alias for tiny int of length 1, so it's going to be a 1 or a 0. So the last thing we need to do is just scroll across and set our user ID to auto increment and set the index to primary. So this is going to be a uniquely generated number, so when you register a user you don't need to specify a value for this field column. Okay, so that's our database set up. If I just hit save, you see it's created a table. If I browse the table, you see it's got 0 rows, and because we are going to be because we're not going to be creating a login page for this, a registration system, sorry, I'm just going to enter some information, but I'm going to enter it manually, but so you don't have to watch me like type through all the information here, I've sort of saved it off to the side somewhere you can't see as an SQL statement. So I'm just going to go over here and copy that now. Copy and paste, and I'm just going to run this SQL. It's just two insert query, well, it's one insert query, inserts 2 rows. Just hit go, you can see it's inserted 2 rows. Hit browse, now you see we have some information. It's just a little time saver, so you don't have to watch me type all this out, because that'd be very boring and pointless, because that's not how you'd actually do it in the real world or whatever. If you were like using this as a real system, you'd do the registration system first, obviously, and that'd fill out the database. So then you could test that by registering a few users and then display profile information on those users, which is why I always do things in that order. I don't ever enter things manually, but just for this, because we're not creating a registration system, I have to. Okay, so that's the database set up, like I said already, and now we're going to be moving on to the files. So if I just go back to our browser, well, we're on our browser, our sort of directory listing folder. The first page we're going to be creating is the user list page, so I'll just open that up and then go to our code. You can see currently the user list page is blank, as is the init file, which is what we're going to create first, because the user list page needs that file. So if we just go to user list, sorry, not user list, we go to our init file, like so. The first thing this file needs to do is start the session. Whoops. Session start. Because we're going to be setting a session variable to simulate the fact that we are logged in as a user, like I said already, well, in part 0, or maybe at the start of this part, I can't remember. So once we've started the session, sort of nothing else happens. We're going to connect to the database, because we're going to be using the database, obviously. So we're going to use Mysql Connect, and the database server we're connecting to is my local server, which is just that. There we go. And the username is example user, and the password is example password. Well, pass, because it's the same length. And then we need to tell the server which database we're working with. So you do that using the MySQL select DB function, and the database name was user profile. Okay, so that's our database connection set up. We could test that now, but it would make sense to finish off this file first. So the only other thing this file needs to do is include this backend file, user.inc.php, and that was in our inc folder. So to do that, what we are going to do is define a path variable as dir name of the file constant. And I've used this before, so I'm not going to explain it in too much detail. But basically, the file constant contains the full server path. So it'll start with like /home/user or something like that. So it'll start with like the root of the server, and it will point to the file that it's used in, basically. So regardless of if this file is included, it'll always point to the full path to this init file itself. and then the dir name function just removes the file name portion from a sort of path. So what we're going to get as a result of this is the full server path to this core folder. So it'll point to this. Okay, so that's pretty much that. And then we're going to be using that to include our files. So we're going to do include something. And then the first thing is going to be this path, and then it doesn't have a slash on the end, so we need slash inc slash user.inc.php. The reason we do this, by the way, instead of just like doing that, is that whichever file, like whichever place, I mean, we could, like, if we do it like this, we could have a file like somewhere else on the server completely that includes this same init file, and then it will still work. It'll still include the right files, because this is always but okay, by doing this, we're making the include relative to this actual file, basically. That's not a very good way to explain it, but you can think of it like that, I guess. Okay, so that's our init file complete. That's how it would actually be in the sort of the real world, I suppose. But just for this, we're going to be setting a session here. Session UID equals 1. And that's just to simulate the fact that a user will be logged in. Session spelled wrong. So in like a real system, you'd set this when they log in, and you'd unset it when they log out. I think I did the exact same thing in my registration system tutorial. The reason I'm not including this in this tutorial is that sort of the focus of this is meant to be the profile system, and to be honest, I'm a little bit bored of login stuff. So yeah, that's pretty much that. I think, yeah, let's just go, okay, let's test this out now by going to our user list page, and we'll include our init file. Let's just do include core/init.inc.php, and now we should be able to test this by going to our browser and reloading our page, and you see it's loaded quickly and fine, which means that our files have all been included correctly. And we can sort of confirm this if you want, just by doing like echo something in here. Bit of a pointless test really, but you simply get the output, which means that this file has been included, so it's sort of worked. So our user list page is going to call a function which is going to fetch a list of all of the users, their user ID and their username, and it's going to sort of output that in a big list. So we need to define that function first, obviously, and that's going to be done in our backend file. So if we just go back to our, backend file, and we're going to define a function here, which is going to be called fetch users. So I'm going to take any parameters, and I've covered this sort of similar method before, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I am going to comment what this function does. Fetches all of the users from the table. Right, so that's that done really. All this function needs to do is a very simple query, so we're just going to set result equal, that's like query result, set that equal to MySQL query, and the query is going to be select user ID as ID. This is just so that we don't have to type user ID all the time in our PHP code. So select user ID as ID. It just sort of sets an alias to the table name, column name even, so it'll show up as ID. I've covered that actually in my MySQL basics video, so if you don't understand what that is, go and watch that. And then we're going to select the next column we're going to select after the comma is username as username, and then that's going to be from the users table. I'm actually slightly running out of time, so I'm going to leave this here and we'll finish this function in the next part.